Thanks so much for joining us for another edition of our Open Mic program. We do have Congressman French Hill with us. And Congressman, thanks so much for taking time and talking with us.
Bob, it's a pleasure to be with you.
We got to start here. Everybody wants to know your experience from last Wednesday. Most chaotic day probably in American history. Protests, people protesting, which happens in D.C. every day, and sometimes the same protesters. But you had 100,000. Explain what happened once they got to the Capitol.
Well, thanks for having me. Yes, last Wednesday did not turn out to be the day people thought it would be. What was a rally on the mall, the National Mall, on the west side of the Capitol, moved from the Washington Monument down to the Capitol shortly after lunch when the Congress was coming into session at 1 o'clock to count the Electoral College votes. And really, the crowd was large, several thousand people at the base of the Capitol. And an element inside that rally crowd turned very aggressive and very violent, and they essentially trampled the Capitol Police and stormed the Capitol building, breaking out doors, windows, and rampaged through the Temple of Democracy, our U.S. Capitol building. And it was shocking. I was in my office in the Longworth House office building, and I could look out my window and see that west front of the Capitol and see the crowd standing there growing by the minute and hear the chants of USA and USA and the sounds of tear gas cans popping off. But it was not until closer to 2 o'clock that we realized that the Capitol was literally under siege and everybody was locked down into their offices at that point.
When you see that, people are saying there's hundreds of thousands of people through the Capitol. It really wasn't that many people, so you can't classify all the protesters as being rioters, correct?
No, it was a rally in favor of President Trump. It started out, as I say, down by the Washington Monument, and several thousand were at the foot of the Capitol. I would say, I don't know how many, 2,000 or 3,000 maybe. And I would say the number that climbed those walls and broke into the Capitol and began rampaging through the Capitol, which was an amazing amount of destruction and appalling and disgusting from what I witnessed and saw, were hundreds. I wouldn't say it was, thousands and thousands. It was hundreds of people who broke into the Capitol.
They're expecting hundreds of criminal cases being filed because of the Capitol Hill riot. Also, Schumer is saying that he thinks anybody that got in the Capitol should be on a no-fly list, which is commendable, really. But it's even gotten down where there was even some news reports that they felt that Ted Cruz should be on a no-fly zone. That's kind of stretching it a little bit, don't you think?
I do. Look, let's be very clear here, and let's maintain our position that we support law and order. And just like all of us were repulsed by peaceful protesters or peaceful rallies this summer who were protesting desire for change in policing, if they turned violent, if they hurt people, if they attacked police officers, if they broke down police lines, if they broke in buildings and looted, if they set buildings on fire, none of that is acceptable. We have a right in our country to peacefully assemble and express our views. And I don't feel any differently about those who broke into the Capitol and destroyed public property and put people's lives at risk. 5 people died in this process, now 6 when the second Capitol policeman is now dead. So I don't put any distinction between someone who looted and created mayhem and criminal acts during the racial-related protests this summer, and I don't make any distinction between those. We don't accept violence in this country as a way to express our political view.
That is what's so important. Protest is what makes America great. It's the debate. And when we even look at this, talking about Senator Ted Cruz said that 40% of Americans have a question mark about the way the election happened and occurred because things were changed and each state had different ways of doing stuff. It should be investigated or at least opened up for investigation. It seems like there's always an investigation going in D.C. and many that you talk to don't understand why that's such a big deal. Explain why it is such a hill to overcome.
Well, I think an investigation into the 2020 election to look at voting patterns and practices in the states would be a good thing and see what we can learn from it and encourage those state legislatures to effect change, modernize their laws, because we all want complete confidence that our vote counts and that the process is done on a fair and open, transparent basis. Now, here's the issue around the 2020 election. President Trump, between November 3rd and December 14th, which is the date under the constitutional process whereby the states are to certify their electors, President Trump vigorously prosecuted every angle he could to make sure the votes were legitimate in those states and certified and recounted, and pursued his legal avenues. Some 60 different cases took place, and there was no material change in any of the votes in those states. And I would remind everybody that 5 of those 6 controversial states are controlled by Republicans, Republican legislators. So after December 14th, that to me was the definitive date where our states, our federal judges, and our state judges all had determined that the election of 2020 essentially was over. So with that said, I do support, as I know Senator Cotton has talked about, a commission to investigate voting practices in the pandemic in these states and offer recommendations to the states to make sure that people have that confidence and have those kinds of transparent voting practices.
Well, when you see that, I mean, that's what I guess that's a big question mark. Well, what's the big deal? I mean, it seems like everything is checked into in D.C. Everybody is going through the mill of some sort. That's just the way it is. Another thing that's kind of a surprising that I take is, I try to shoot down the middle. I think that's very important. When you report the news, I don't care if you're Republican or Democrat, we report it. But when it came to Parler, when they deleted President Trump's accounts off of Twitter, which to me, I guess I'm a capitalist at first. If you remember, we talked about this years ago, back in 2016. He tweets, what's the deal with tweet? And I said, that's his soundbite. And I said, could you imagine? Twitter was going out of business. It just wasn't getting any traction until the president came along, and now it's kind of a household word every day, sometimes 6 or 7 times a day, and then they delete him. I thought that was kind of ironic that the person that made you the business. Then they went to Twitter, went and deleted it, right? And then they went to the Parler, and Parler was taken off of the Apple Store, and then Google took it off of their store. So they basically shut it down. They still were growing unbelievable. And then you had Amazon shut down their servers. That's kind of creepy, really, if you look back.
Well, we all know that these are private companies. And when I sign up for the terms and conditions to use Gmail or to have a Facebook account or to have a Twitter account, I've agreed to certain things in those terms and conditions. I think very few Americans know what they've agreed to when they check those yes boxes on the terms and conditions. But this is not the government censoring. This, of course, is that private player saying, I don't want you there. And the legal reference is, if I go into a restaurant and I don't comply with their deportment, if I'm drunk and disorderly, that restaurant owner can ask me to leave, and that's the legal argument here. But here's my concern. These are huge, powerful companies that are choke points in the communications arena in not just our country but the world. So they have an oligopoly type position, and how do we hold them account for the fairness of their decisions? Okay, so let's assume the terms and conditions are there, and let's assume we all agree to them. Are they enforced identically for someone on the left as the right? And that's the part where I don't think there's clear evidence of that at all. And therefore, they're tipping the scale. And as you and I've talked about the broadcast business before, where you have a fairness doctrine, you have an equal protection obligation, you have a decency act protection on vulgarity, for example, in live public broadcast. What of these platforms are they? True town hall simply posting sites, or are they performing a media company or a broadcast obligation? So I think Congress is going to investigate all of this. President Trump raised that issue with the so-called Section 230 immunity for the big tech platforms. The Democrats have done a 2-year investigation of the antitrust, anti-monopoly rules connected with big tech platforms. So I hope in 2021 that we'll have an open and candid debate about their future and how they should operate.
When you look at that, though, that is something that is we're going into a new world. I remember when there was a breakup of AT&T and Ma Bell and all those phone companies had to be broke up because they had too much control. And it's the same thing. You can't do that with a government which watches over your phone company. It's controlled by FCC. They got rules. It's different. That is a public company instead of a private company. And we need to explain that because some people don't understand the difference, never thought about it. Probably like you said, we never read those terms and conditions. It's 30 pages long.
Yeah, well, I think this should be concerning to people, and I think they need more information around which to come to a conclusion, and that's why I think it's important for Congress to be involved in this in the direction and get a lot of feedback from the American people. But in the meantime, the bottom line is the enforcement of those terms and conditions being fairly applied by someone at Twitter or someone at Facebook or someone at Amazon Web Services, or is it not? And do they have any obligation to do that? So these are all open questions, and I think what we need in our country is transparency on this and more competition.
True, and that's one thing that many people were talking about, that Parler, that was a competition that was turned off, but it'll be coming back. Another thing we got to talk about, I know you got to go, and that is the impeachment process. Do you feel that President-elect Biden, who said he's the unifier, is he going to stand up and say, hey, we just need to pull the country together because this is splitting a country? What is your take?
Oh gosh, I'm disappointed by President-elect Joe Biden, and I'm disappointed by Donald Trump, President Donald Trump here, because these two men could be a part of reducing the noise, reducing the division right now following the Capitol crisis last Wednesday, January 6th. And President Trump is not really doing that, and Vice President Biden is not doing it either. I think they both should step up and say, let's move towards a civil discourse. Let's heal the country. Let's bring back some good feelings here so that we can work together. The two of them have the power to do that. But instead, they're being relatively silent. They're in their corners. And so Nancy Pelosi is trying to drive a divisive impeachment vote through the House this week, which will not be taken up by the Senate, which will not result in the president's removal from office, which will not result in a fair and open look for the facts about what actually happened on January 6th, which will not result in the president being able to tell his side of the story or not. It's just all politics, and it's divisive. And I'll leave you with this. We need less brinkmanship right now in our country and more leadership in our country, and our country's crying out for it.
Well said. Congressman French Hill, thanks so much for taking time and talking with us here on this open mic.
Best wishes, Bob. Thanks. Happy New Year.